Encyclical Letter Laudato Si of the Holy Father Francis on care for our common home. Laudato Si, mi Signore. Praise be to you, my Lord. In the words of this beautiful canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. Romans chapter 8, verse 22. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. Nothing in this world is indifferent to us. More than 50 years ago, with the world teetering on the brink of nuclear crisis, Pope St. John the 23rd wrote an encyclical which not only rejected war but offered a proposal for peace. He addressed his message, Pacem in terris, to the entire Catholic world, indeed to all men and women of good will. Now, faced as we are with global environmental deterioration, I wish to address every person living on this planet. In my apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, I wrote to all members of the Church with the aim of encouraging ongoing missionary renewal. In this encyclical, I would like to enter into dialogue with all people about our common home. In 1971, 8 years after Pacem in Terris, Blessed Pope Paul VI referred to the ecological concern as a tragic consequence of unchecked human activity. Due to an ill-considered exploitation of nature, humanity runs the risk of destroying it and becoming in turn a victim of this degradation. He spoke in similar terms to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations about the potential for an ecological catastrophe under this effective explosion of industrial civilization, and stressed the urgent need for a radical change in the conduct of humanity, inasmuch as the most extraordinary scientific advances, the most amazing technical abilities, the most astonishing economic growth, unless they are accompanied by the authentic social and moral progress, will definitely turn against man. St. John Paul II became increasingly concerned about this issue. In his first encyclical, he warned that human beings frequently seem to see no other meaning than their natural environment than what serves for immediate use and consumption. Frequently, he would call for a global ecological conversion. At the same time, he noted that little effort had been made to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology. The destruction of the human environment is extremely serious, not only because God has entrusted the world to us men and women, but because human life itself, a gift, which must be defended from various forms of debasement. Every effort to protect and improve our world entails profound changes in lifestyles, models of production and consumption, and the established structures of power, which today govern societies. Authentic human development has moral character. It presumes full respect for the human person, but it must also be concerned for the world around us and take into account the nature of each being and of its mutual connection in an ordered system. Accordingly, our human ability to transform reality must proceed in line with God's original gift of all that is. My predecessor, Benedict XVI, likewise proposed eliminating the structural causes of the dysfunctions of the world economy and correcting models of growth which have proved incapable of ensuring respect for the environment. He observed that the world cannot be analyzed by isolating only one of its aspects, since the book of nature is one and indivisible, and includes the environment, life, sexuality, the family, social relations, and so forth. It follows that the deterioration of nature is closely connected to pop culture, which shapes human coexistence. Pope Benedict asked us to recognize that the natural environment has been gravely damaged by our irresponsible behavior. The social environment has also suffered damage. Both are ultimately due to the same evil, the notion that there is no indisputable truths to guide our lives, and hence human freedom is limitless. We have forgotten that man is not only a freedom which he creates for himself. Man does not create himself. He is spirit and will, but also nature. With paternal concern, Benedict urged us to realize that creation is harmed, where we ourselves have the final word, where everything is simply our property and we use it for ourselves alone. The misuse of creation begins when we no longer recognize any higher instance than ourselves, when we see nothing else but ourselves. United by the same concern, the statements of the popes echo the reflections of the numerous scientists, philosophers, theologians, and civic groups, all of which have enriched the Church's thinking on these questions. Outside the Catholic Church, other churches and Christian communities, and other religions as well, have expressed deep concern and offered valuable reflections on issues which all of us find disturbing. To give just one striking example, I would mention the statements made by the beloved ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, with whom we share the hope of a full ecclesiar communion. Patriarch Bartholomew has spoken in particular of the needs for each of us to repent of the ways we have harmed the planet, for inasmuch as we generate small ecological damage, we are called to acknowledge our contribution, greater or smaller, to the disfigurement and destruction of creation. He has repeatedly stated this firmly and persuasively, challenging us to acknowledge our sins against creation, for human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests and destroying its wetlands, for human beings to contaminate the earth's waters, its land, its air, and its life. These are sins. For to commit a crime against the natural world is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God. In the same time, Bartholomew has drawn attention to the ethical and spiritual roots of environmental problems, which require that we look for solutions not only in technology, but in a change of humanity. Otherwise, we would be dealing merely with symptoms. He asks us to replace consumption with sacrifice, greed with generosity, wastefulness with a spirit of sharing, and asceticism which entails learning to give and not simply to give up. It is a way of loving, of moving gradually away from what I want to what God's world needs. It is a liberation from fear, greed, and compulsion. As Christians, we are also called to accept the world as a sacrament of communion, as a way of sharing with God and our neighbors on a global scale. It is our humble conviction that the divine and the human meet in the slightest detail, in the seamless garment of God's creation, in the last speck of dust of our planet. St. Francis of Assisi. I do not want to write this encyclical without turning to that attractive and compelling figure, whose name I took as my guide and inspiration when I was elected Bishop of Rome. Believe that St. Francis is an example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. He is the patron saint of all who study and work in the area of ecology, and he is also much loved by non-Christians. He was particularly concerned for God's creation and for the poor and outcast. He loved and was deeply loved for his joy, his generous self-giving, his open-heartedness. He was a mystic and a pilgrim who lived in simplicity and in wonderful harmony with God, with others, with nature, and with himself. He shows us just how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. Francis helps us to see that integral ecology calls for openness to categories which transcend the language of mathematics and biology and take us to the heart of what is to be human. Just as happens when we fall in love with someone, whenever he would gaze at the sun, the moon, or the smallest of animals, he burst into song, drawing all other creatures into his praise. He communed with all creation, even preaching to the flowers, inviting them to praise the Lord, just as if they were endowed with reason. His response to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation or economic calculus, for to him each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection. This is why he felt called to care for all that exists. His disciple, Saint Bonaventure, tells us that, from a reflection on the primary source of all things, filled with even more abundant piety, he would call all creatures, no matter how small, by the name of brother or sister. Such a conviction cannot be written off as naive romanticism, for it affects the choices which determine our behavior. If we approach nature and the environment without this openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. The poverty and austerity of St. Francis were no mere veneer of asceticism, but something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. What is more, St. Francis, faithful to the Scripture, invites us to see nature as a magnificent book in which God speaks to us and grants us a glimpse of his infinite beauty and goodness. Through the greatness and the beauty of creatures, one comes to know by analogy their Maker. Wisdom, chapter 13, verse 5. Indeed, His eternal power and divinity have been made known through his work since the creation of the world. For this reason, Francis asks that part of the friary garden always be left untouched, so that wild flowers and herbs could grow there, and those who saw them could raise their minds to God, creator of such beauty. Rather than a problem to be solved, the world is a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and praise. My appeal. The urgent challenge to protect our common home includes a concern to bring the whole human family together to seek a sustainable and integral development. For we know that things can change. The Creator does not abandon us. He never forsakes his loving plan or repents of having created us. Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. Here I want to recognize, encourage, and thank all those who striving in countless ways to guarantee the protection of the home which we share. Particular appreciation is owed to those who tirelessly seek to resolve the tragic effects of environmental degradation on the lives of the world's poorest. Young people demand change. They wonder how anyone can claim to be building a better future without thinking of the environmental crisis and the suffering of the excluded. I urgently appeal, then, for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. The worldwide ecological movement had already been made considerable progress and led to the establishment of numerous organizations committed to raising awareness of these challenges. Regrettably, many efforts to seek concrete solutions to the environmental crisis have proved ineffective, not only because of powerful opposition, but also because of a more general lack of interest. Obstructionist attitudes, even on the parts of believers, can range from denial of the problem to indifference, nonchalant resignation, or blind confidence in technical solutions. We require a new and universal solidarity. As the bishops of Southern Africa have stated, everyone's talent and involvement are needed to redress the damage caused by human abuse of God's creation. All of us can cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation, each according to his or her own culture, experience, and involvement and talents. It is my hope that this encyclical letter, which is now added to the body of the Church's social teaching, can help us to acknowledge the appeal, immense, and urgency of the challenge we face. We will begin by briefly reviewing several aspects of the present ecological crisis, with the aim of drawing the results of the best scientific research available today, letting them touch us deeply and provide a concrete foundation for the ethical and spiritual itinerary that follows. I will then consider some principles drawn from the Judeo-Christian tradition, which can render our commitment to the environment more coherent. I will then attempt to get at the roots of the present situation, so as to consider not only its symptoms, but also its deepest causes. This will help to provide an approach to ecology which respects our unique place as human beings in this world and our relationship to our surroundings. In light of this reflection, I will advance some broader proposals for dialogue and action which would involve each of us as individuals and also affect international policy. Finally, convinced as I am that change is impossible without motivation and process of education, I will offer some inspired guidelines for human development to be found in the treasure of Christian spiritual experience. Although each chapter will have its own subject and specific approach, it will also take up and re-examine important questions previously dealt with. This is particularly the case with a number of themes which will reappear as the encyclical unfolds. As examples, I will point to the intimate relation between the poor and the fragility of the planet, the conviction that everything in the world is connected, the critique of new paradigms and forms of power derived from technology, the call to seek other ways of understanding the economy and progress, the value proper to each creature, the human meaning of ecology, the need for forthright and honest debate, the serious responsibility of international and local policy, the throwaway culture, and the proposal of a new lifestyle. These questions will not be dealt with once and for all, but reframed and enriched again and again. Chapter 1. What is happening to our common home? Theological and philosophical reflections on the situation of humanity and the world can sound tiresome and abstract, unless they are grounded in a fresh analysis of our present situation, which is in many ways unprecedented in the history of humanity. So, before considering how faith brings new incentives and requirements with regard to the world in which we are a part, I will briefly turn to what is happening to our common home. The continued acceleration of changes affecting humanity and the planet is coupled today with a more intensified pace of life and work which might be called rapidification. Although change is part of the working of complex systems, the speed in which human activity has developed contrasts with the natural slow pace of biological evolution. More, the goals of this rapid and constant change are not necessarily geared to the common good or to integral and sustainable human development. Change is something desirable, yet it becomes a source of anxiety when it causes harm to the world and to the quality of life of much of humanity. Following a period of irrational confidence in progress and human abilities, some sectors of societies are now adopting a more critical approach. We see increasingly sensitivity to the environment and the need to protect nature, along with a growing concern, both genuine and distressing, for what is happening to our planet. Let us review, however cursorily, those questions which are troubling us today and which we can no longer sweep under the carpet. Our goal is not to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. 1. Pollution and climate change. Pollution, waste, and the throwaway culture. Some forms of pollution are part of people's daily experience. Exposure to atmospheric pollutants produce a broad spectrum of health hazards, especially for the poor, and causes millions of premature deaths. People take sick, for example, from breathing high levels of smoke from fuels used in cooking and heating. There is also pollution that affects everyone, caused by transport, industrial fumes, substances which contribute to the acidification of soil and water, fertilizers, insecticide, fungicides, herbicides, and agrotoxins in general. Technology, which linked to business interests, is presented as the only way of solving these problems, in fact proves incapable of seeing the mysterious network of relations between things, and so sometimes solves one problem only to create others. Account must be also taken of the pollution produced by residue, including dangerous waste present in different areas. Each year, hundreds of millions of tons of waste are generated, much of it non-biodegradable, highly toxic and radioactive, from homes and businesses, from construction and demolition sites, from clinical, electronic, and industrial sources. The Earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. In many parts of the planet, the elderly lament that once beautiful landscapes are now covered with rubbish. Industrial waste and chemical products utilized in cities and agricultural areas can lead to bioaccumulation of the organisms of the local population, even when levels of toxins in those places are low. Frequently, no measures are taken until after people's health have been irreversibly affected. These problems are closely linked to a throwaway culture which affects the excluded just as it quickly reduces things to rubbish. To cite one example, most of the paper we produce is thrown away and not recycled. It is hard for us to accept that way natural ecosystems work as exemplary. Plants synthesize nutrients which feed herbivores. These in turn become food for carnivores, which produce significant quantities of organic waste, which give rise to new generations of plants. But our industrial system, at the end of its cycle of production and consumption, has not developed the capacity to absorb and reuse waste in byproducts. We have not yet managed to adopt a circular model of production capable of preserving resources for present and future generations, while limiting as much as possible the use of non-renewable resources, moderating their consumption, maximizing their efficient use, reusing and recycling them. A serious consideration of this issue would be one way of counteracting the throwaway culture, which affects the entire planet, but it must be said that only limited progress has been made in this regard. Climate as common good. The climate is a common good, belonging to all and meant for all. At the global level, it is a complex system linked to many of the essential conditions for human life. A very solid scientific consensus indicates that we are presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climatic system. In recent decades, this warming has been accompanied by a constant rise in the sea level and would appear by increase of extreme weather events, even of a scientifically determinable cause, cannot be assigned to each particular phenomenon. Humanity is called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat this warming, or at least the human causes which produce or aggravate it. It is true that there are other factors, such as volcanic activity, variations in the Earth's orbit and axis, the solar cycle. Yet a number of scientific studies indicate that most global warming in recent decades is due to great concentration of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxides, and others, released mainly as a result of human activity. As these gases build up in the atmosphere, they hamper the escape of heat produced by the sunlight at the Earth's surface. The problem is aggravated by a model of development based on an intensive use of fossil fuels, which is at the heart of the worldwide energy system. Another determining factor has been an increase in changed uses of the soil, principally deforestation for agricultural purposes. Warming has effects on the carbon cycle. It creates a vicious circle which aggravates the situation even more, affecting the ability of essential resources like drinking water, energy and agricultural production in warmer regions, and leading to the extinction of part of the planet's biodiversity. The melting of the polar ice caps and in high altitude plains can lead to the dangerous release of methane gas, while the decomposition of frozen organic material can further increase the emission of carbon dioxide. Things are made worse by the loss of tropical forests, which would otherwise help to mitigate climate change. Carbon dioxide pollution increases the acidification of the oceans and compromises the marine food chain. If present trends continue, this century may well witness extraordinary climate change and an unprecedented destruction of ecosystems with serious consequences for all of us. A rise in the sea level, for example, can create extremely serious situations. If we consider that a quarter of the world's population lives on the coast or nearby, and that the majority of our megacities are situated in coastal areas. Climate change is a global problem with grave implications environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Its worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries in coming decades. Many of the poor live in areas particularly affected by phenomena related to warming, and their means of subsistence are largely dependent on natural reserves and ecosystemic services such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry. They have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change or to face natural disasters, and their access to social services and protection is very limited. For example, changes in climate to which animals and plants cannot adapt lead them to migrate, and this in turn affects the livelihood of the poor who are then forced to leave their homes and with great uncertainty for their future and that of their children. There has been a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty caused by environmental degradation. They are not recognized by international conventions as refugees. They bear the loss of the lives they have left behind without enjoying any legal protection whatsoever. Sadly, there is widespread indifference to such sufferings, which is even now taking place throughout our world. Our lack of response to these tragedies involving our brothers and sisters points to the loss of the sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women upon which all society is founded. Many of those who possess more resources and economic or political power seem mostly to be concerned with masking the problem or concealing their symptoms, simply making efforts to reduce some of the negative impacts of climate change. However, many of these symptoms indicate that such effects will continue to worsen if we continue with current models of production and consumption. There is an urgent need to develop policies so that, in the next few years, the emission of carbon dioxide and other highly polluting gases can be drastically reduced. For example, substituting for fossil fuels and developing sources of renewable energy. Worldwide, there is minimal access to clean and renewable energy. There is still a need to develop adequate storage technologies. Some countries have made considerable progress, although it is far from constituting a significant proportion. Investments have been made in means of production and transportation which consume less energy and require fewer raw materials, as well as in methods of construction and renovating buildings which improve their energy sufficient. But these practices are still far from widespread.